So, good evening, everyone. We, we're so happy to see you. There's been a lot of interest in this topic, what may happen in Post-Dobbs North Carolina. My name is Galia Paliga, and I am the president of NC Now, the North Carolina chapter of the National Organization for Women. This event is co-sponsored by Now chapters, by local chapters of Chapel Hill Now, Raleigh Now, and Triad Now. And it's also co-sponsored by the Temple Beth Or Tikkun Olam Committee, which is our social action committee, and the Temple Beth Or Sisterhood, who are feeding us. We welcome you to our panel discussion, Living in Post-Dobbs, North Carolina. This is a hybrid event with some of us in person here and some by Zoom. And I know most of us are in North Carolina. However, I have at least one Now friend joining from California. Hi, Geraldine. And I always appreciate Zoom. It allows people to stay safe and attend from anywhere. It's wonderful. Many people have been meeting regularly to put this event together, and I want to thank them right up front because we don't say who they are in the program. And so it's Tikkun Olam Committee President Susan Cohan, Now member and Raleigh Women's March organizer Penny DePaw, Temple, the Tikkun Olam Committee member Phyllis Lefebvre, who you guys saw at the front table, Chapel Hill Now President Jerry Richards right there, Tikkun Olam Committee member Maxine Smith, who's keeping me company, and also Sherry Thorstad. Durham Now President Jennifer Albright is hopefully on Zoom, but she started working on this last September. And also I wanted to mention the Sisterhood member Maureen Wertheim and Lynn Hamilton Moody and Pauline for being here and helping in person. And to Weta Watson for helping with the detailed plan and Zoom, and Mark Grossman for all the stuff he's doing up there with the equipment. And our panelists, who you're going to hear from very soon. It is bittersweet to have this event as we recognize the 50th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision, which gave women control over their own bodies. As now President Christian Nunes said, while Roe was a watershed moment that catapulted women closer to achieving full equality, Dobbs reversed half a century of progress, not just for women, but for the country as a whole. You'll find that statement in NC Now's pro-choice signature ad, which was published yesterday in Indie Week, the weekly magazine that's available in the Triangle. I'm sure you know about this, most of you. And it looks like this. And so we take over the centerfold, and we've got hundreds of names of pro-choice supporters. And we have quotes. This year we quoted Nancy Pelosi because she's so amazing. And she does all that she does under pressure with grace. And so she said things like, the radical Supreme Court is eviscerating American rights and endangering their health and safety. She said, the hypocrisy is raging, but the harm is endless. And she said, it's a slap in the face to women about using their own judgment. So she, has had a lot to say about this. And there are other extra copies of this out in the hall if you're interested. And that will be available, the indie is available for a week, so you can pick them up until Tuesday. So our panel will explore things like what doctors, medical professionals, and patients are facing, how it may impact working doctors and also medical students entering the field, how this decision interferes with people's beliefs, including Judaism, and what kind of restrictions we may expect from the NC General Assembly, where the leadership is strongly anti-abortion. I will say in good news today that pro-choice lawmakers put forth a bill to codify safe and legal abortion access. And another remedy could come when the Equal Rights Amendment is finally published, which should have been 3 years ago this month. The Supreme Court of the United States overturning Roe v. Wade as part of the Dobbs v. Jackson Health Organization decision has created a good deal of anger, uncertainty, and anxiety through the country, including in North Carolina. Abortion bans have already been imposed in surrounding states. Some of the pregnant individuals are coming to North Carolina for care already. In North Carolina, we still have around 16 abortion clinics, and they're all in the larger cities. 91% of counties in North Carolina don't have them. Others are being forced to carry fetuses to term and figure out what to do from there. In many ways, the new post-Roe, post-Dobbs reality is much worse than pre-Roe. You should all have your programs now, and if you don't, tell Jennifer, raise your hand in purple, and you can always share with a neighbor. And they're available online. So whoever's on Zoom, there should be a link in the chat telling you where to get the program from. The program includes the agenda. It includes biographies of the panelists. This would be on the back side for you guys. It includes some ideas about actions, quick thank yous, and it includes Temple Beth Or Tikkun Olam committee statement in support of abortion access. So this is also hot off the presses as of Sunday, as of the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. As you can see in the agenda, there's time set aside for questions from the audience. And how we're going to handle that is attendees, we have postcards. So Phyllis with her hand up and Penny in the back have postcards, and you guys can write questions on postcards, and they're going to distill the questions down because we don't have a lot. We only have 15 minutes for Q&A. So they're going to distill the questions down, and we will address them to the panelists in that time period. Now we're going to try to take a couple of questions from Zoom as well, sort of the same method. Weeda's going to monitor those and take 2 of them, basically. We hope that you have come to learn more about these issues, and this panel will inspire you to learn more and do more to try to keep abortion safe and legal and accessible in North Carolina. I believe we all have dreams for a better and safer future for women, children, and families in North Carolina. Okay, so the panelists now are going to introduce themselves with just a sentence from me. So we're going to start with Dr. Beverly Gray, who's an obstetrician and gynecologist and who also runs the residency program at Duke. And she's been quoted a lot in the news lately, talking about Dobbs. So please go ahead.
Okay, that's my introduction, okay. My name's Bev Gray. I am an OBGYN. I'm originally from North Carolina, so I grew up in Western North Carolina on a small farm where my parents still live. And I made my way to the Triangle a long time ago. Went to high school at the School of Science and Math in Durham, and I've pretty much been in the Triangle area ever since. So aside from 2 years in the Peace Corps, my husband and I served in the Peace Corps in Ecuador, and then came back. And it was in the Peace Corps that I decided that I wanted to be a doctor. And I had no idea that my path would take me where it has to this point of being able to lead a group of residents, to be able to provide care that I think is really important, that people need, that saves lives. But I also think I was not really prepared for what medicine would be like it is now. So making it through the pandemic, making it through Dobbs. I heard a speaker yesterday who was talking a lot about moral injury and how as physicians in the field, we go into this work with a sense of duty and a sense of justice. And we're faced with so many obstacles to care for people on the day-to-day that we are morally injured in our work. And I definitely feel that. I think there are moments where I feel very invigorated about the work that I do. Like being here with you all is one of those moments, and being with people who are motivated to help support the lives of the patients that I care for. I think that's really important. So I have like about 5 or 6 different jobs. So one, I actually do see patients and take care of patients. I deliver babies, I provide abortion care, I do well woman exams, I do the whole spectrum of kind of general OBGYN. A big part of my job has become complex family planning, though, and so caring for patients who are medically complicated, who need contraception, who need abortion care, who need miscarriage care. And you can imagine that at a place like Duke, that we take care of a lot of complicated patients, and patients that unfortunately now are coming from all over the Southeast. This week I've cared for patients from Georgia, from Florida, from North Carolina. Off and on over these past 6 months, we've cared for a lot of patients from South Carolina as their laws change rapidly. The other part of my job is I'm the residency director, so I am in charge of training 36 residents to be the best OBGYNs they can be, and they're amazing people, and they, we're a top residency program, so we attract a lot of amazing, talented people. And helping them through the uncertainty of Dobbs has also been part of my job, not knowing what this next year will bring. Recruiting a new class of residents who are maybe a little unsure about moving to North Carolina right now because of what's happening in the legislature. So we attract these amazing people to North Carolina who want to move here and live here and take care of people like you, but maybe now they're hesitant to do that. So that's another part of my job. I also work with a group of physicians that provide care to lower resource patients of the Durham and surrounding areas as well. So I get to lead that group. So I have a lot of really cool things that I do in my work, but a lot of my work has become advocacy and kind of getting the message out about why this care is important, why the work that we do shouldn't be hindered by laws from people who really don't understand what goes on in people's lives every single day. And so I can be a medical expert, but the patients who come to see me, they're the experts of their lives. They know what they need, they know what they're facing, and it's really frustrating when other people think they can be experts for them.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. So Rabbi Dinner is reaching her 30th year leading Temple Beth Or this summer. And she has been the spiritual leader for countless people over the years. So please go ahead, Rabbi.
So it's really a privilege and a passion of mine to be here to fight for women's rights and for human rights to health care with you. It is with somewhat of a degree or a large degree of sadness that we are here doing this again. When I first started my career in St. Louis, Missouri, I was then 33 years ago, fighting this issue in Missouri. It was post-Roe versus Wade, but the then governor of Missouri, who later became Attorney General of the United States, was trying to block the right to abortion for women. And so I went to the legislators and legislature with cohorts from St. Louis and from all around the state, and both spoke to legislators and rallied there, and was in a really groundbreaking group eventually in St. Louis that gave me hope then, even with the fight. And that group said, what if we got people together who were on both sides of the issue and at least began to agree on things we can agree on, like everyone, boys and girls, need sex education that is accurate and informative, and drawing up curriculum for that, and that everyone needed access, every woman needed access to health care to assess their personal needs and to prevent pregnancy if that was what they wanted. It was really one of the highest level groups that I've been a part of for my whole career, that we had major differences and yet sat at the table and said, somebody's got to sit down and figure out what we can agree on and at least provide that. My husband was health and sex education educator at a major public school in St. Louis. And when we moved to North Carolina, I was aghast. There were two things that hit me right away 30 years ago. My husband looked at the curriculum, which is not much different than it is now. There's just a little more leeway now, but not much. And he said, I couldn't with any ethical demeanor teach health education in this state. So for a while left teaching altogether, which was a real loss, in my opinion, because he's a great teacher. Did come back and ended up teaching anatomy and physiology and other sciences, but that's for another day. So the second thing that happened was, it was the year that a legislator from North Carolina, I guess it was just to welcome me, proposed a law that said that in addition to not teaching anything about birth control or how not to have a baby or abortion in public schools, or even sex and what it was, that the one thing they could teach was that if you had sex, that both partners should spray themselves with Lysol. You remember this, don't you? That was it. And I just thought, what has happened? Where am I? So I've watched this issue and been a part of women's rights issues, and in many ways felt like Raleigh and the Triangle is a bubble for women's rights in general for much of this time, and then watched not only the Dobbs case, but also, I want to say 8-10 years ago, I had a bat mitzvah student. They all have to have projects they work on. So this student said to me, for my project to help the community, I want to work on women's rights. And I looked at her and I said, well, okay, what kind of blocks do you see to women's rights? And she was so ahead of her time. It was probably, 6 months before the legislature started eroding women's rights here. And ever since then, it's just been horrendous for women and men and humans in this state. And so we have to keep the work up. We have to do it. It's part of our job, not to complete the work. Our Jewish tradition says it's not your obligation, but you cannot stop in the task. So that's a little who I am with this issue.
Thank you. I think sex education wasn't too bad until like 1994.
Yeah, I got here in 93.
Yeah, that's when it was going, it was going bad. But before that, it had been somewhat reasonable. Rob Schofield is director of NC Policy Watch, and he keeps tens of thousands of us informed on the policies helping and hurting North Carolinians around the state.
Well, thank you, Galia. And thanks to a lot of friends and familiar faces who I see here tonight. It's good to see you all. It's good to be with you. This issue is one that I've spent most of my professional career following very closely. My first real job out of law school, permanent job, was I was the legislative director for the ACLU of Illinois. They sent me to Springfield in the mid-'80s, and the first bill I worked on was actually a bill from a Democratic legislator to restrict sex ed in general, in the Illinois. So we've come somewhere. Illinois is not doing that kind of nonsense anymore. And I spent several weeks going around with a very impressive couple who had lost their daughter to an illegal abortion in Indiana because of a parental notice law. And they were, God, we had to go and give that speech dozens of times. I watched them cry every time about their daughter, how they had lost her because she was afraid to come forward and had sought an illegal abortion and had died, which was very moving to me. And it wasn't like I wasn't already on board with the cause, but it made an enormous lasting impression on me, that experience. So I've spent the last 30 years, like Rabbi Dinner, here in North Carolina. Actually, 31 years now. For the first half of that time, I was a lawyer lobbyist for a group called the North Carolina Justice Center, where we represented poor people. Still, that organization still does that work. For the last 15 years, I've been working really as a journalist for an organization called NC Policy Watch, which has been a part of the Justice Center. Many of you, of course, know Chris Fitzsimon, my longtime colleague at Policy Watch. Chris has gone on to found a national network. Here's a happy thing. I mean, there's not a lot of good news in the world these days. Here's a good one. States Newsroom is a growing national news network of state capital-based newsroom based on our model, headquartered in Chapel Hill, that Chris leads these days, and we're in the process of continuing to grow closer to that organization at Policy Watch. But there's the Virginia Mercury and the Nevada Current and the Arizona Mirror and the Michigan Advance. There's news, and it's headed towards total national coverage. There's also a Washington, D.C. bureau. So there's this growing network of really good journalists doing really good work, married with progressive commentary on an array of issues. We have a great team at NC Policy Watch. I've got a team of veteran journalists who, most of them have come from what we now refer to as the legacy media, the local newspapers that are kind of evaporating before our eyes. We've just got a great team. Lynn Bonner, many of you know from her days with the News and Observer. Joe Killian, who's broken all kinds of important stories. He was with the Greensboro News and Record before he came to us. Greg Childress was with the Durham Herald-Sun for many years. We've got Lisa Sorg, who's the best environmental reporter in the country, in my estimation. We've hired this young, incredibly dynamic young journalist, a guy by the name of Kellen Lyons, who just joined us last year. Kellen is covering prisons and the court system in our state. So we've got a really great team, along with Clayton Henkel, who is our communications coordinator, produces a radio show that we do, the commentaries, in a very cool transformation of the universe. I kind of have Jesse Helms' old job, which is kind of cool if you think about it, because, Jesse used to do the commentary on the Channel 5 News each night before he became a senator. And at least, on the radio version on Mix 101, I get to do that every night. So if y'all have ideas for 1 minute of commentary every day, I just did one on this issue, actually. But anyway, that's sort of who I am. I hope you'll check us out at NC Policy Watch. And I'm really interested and excited to try to, think positively about how we can move this issue forward tonight.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, all of you. We're so thrilled you're all here. So we're going to move into the into the panelist questions that we provided the questions for. So if you want to get a postcard, raise your hand, and Phyllis and Penny will bring you a postcard. But you have to have your own pen, I think. And how we're going to do this is we're going to have Rob go first and talk about the laws so we're all on the same page. And then we can talk about what they mean.
Well, Bev lives it every day. She may know it even better than I do. I think that maybe that's why I'm here, right? Is to be someone who follows the law in North Carolina, at least somewhat in the General Assembly. I mean, as you all know, we have a restrictive law on abortion rights in the state. It's better than Texas. It's better than a lot of places, but we have a 20-week cap, as it were. We have other restrictions in terms of waiting periods and that are unnecessary and clearly designed to dissuade people from exercising what ought to be their constitutional right. We have a lawsuit that was just filed this week against the law that purports to restrict how women can access medical abortions through medicine, through drug-induced abortions. North Carolina is, again, it's a sanctuary state for people who are coming from Georgia, from Tennessee, but it's far from where it ought to be. I think that's probably a fair assessment. And the unfortunate expectation is that we will have a very aggressive effort to make it a lot worse in the General Assembly session that's just gotten underway.
Right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to direct a question to somebody, and the other panelists are welcome to chime in if they would like.
So the other restrictions we have a parental consent law as well. But many of these laws are not grounded in any medical fact. I mean, I think, and they're just rude. I mean, to have a 72-hour waiting period, it's basically the legislature saying, you know, for most of these women in our state that make this decision, you need to go sit in the corner for 72 hours and really think about it. It's just, it's horrible. So, I mean, people, when they pick up the phone and they make the appointment, they have made that decision that they want to come. And really, when they walk into the door, they've made that decision. And then for the patients who are still on the fence, like sometimes they leave without care. We counsel, we talk to them, we help them get to a point where they feel as certain as they can feel. But like I said before, people are the experts in their lives. They don't need a 72-hour waiting period to help them make that decision. And when they ask people, you know, what do you think about the 72-hour waiting period? Most people say, you know, maybe it would help somebody else, but it really didn't help me. For most people, you know, it's not helpful. It doesn't help them make their decision. It just creates one more hurdle to get the care that's evidence-based. The 20-week ban is unfortunate. I mean, there are very few cases in North Carolina are past 20 weeks, but those cases are often complex or, you know, reasons that, you know, most people will never face in their lives or their pregnancies, but some people do. So medically complex pregnancies, really severe birth defects. Teenagers sometimes fall into that window. So, you know, when the Dobbs decision came down, I was very sad, but I think when the 20-week ban fell in North Carolina, that was actually a lot more emotional for me. I was one of the plaintiffs on the case against the state where we were reversed against the 20-week ban for a short period of time for a couple of years, and it was really great to be part of that advocacy to help get patients care. And even if it's only a small percentage of patients, it still matters so much for them.
Can you tell us what the current ultrasound requirement is?
So let me take that back. So there's a form for every abortion case that's performed in North Carolina. You have to submit information to the state. And really the only ultrasound piece of the law is that if a patient's above 16 weeks, you have to have an ultrasound image that you send to the state to confirm their dating of their pregnancy. I don't know who reviews that. I don't know. It goes to the state.
I think if it was a different Department of Health and Human Services, that would be more, and can be in the future.
So the question was, is a patient forced to see an ultrasound? No, they're not. I think, for all of our patients we care for, we ask them if they want to see it even before we perform the ultrasound. And then in our state, there are no state funds that can be used for abortion care. And so patients are paying for all of the pieces of this care out of pocket.
But do try to hold your questions and write them on the piece of paper. Okay. What kind of restrictions might we expect from the legislature? I know there have been articles and some maneuvering.
Well, first of all, it's important to remember, that there's this sort of mythology that, oh, this sends it back to the states. Dobbs sends it back to the states. But of course, it's important to remember, no, it doesn't. If the anti-abortion folks were to take control of Congress and the presidency, they could pass a nationwide ban under the Dobbs decision. But what we expect in North Carolina is undoubtedly there will be some extreme total ban legislation introduced, at least. We've had that before. It seems almost certain that there will be an effort to mimic what's being done in states like Texas and Mississippi and Alabama. Senator Berger, who is the president pro tem of the Senate, for what it's worth, I guess it's interesting, has more or less stuck to the line that he's thinking, well, I think we want to restrict it to the first trimester, which, as right-wing conservative politicians go these days, perhaps is not as extreme as we might fear. It'd still be terrible. House Speaker Tim Moore, kind of vague about it. He just says it's top priority to restrict abortion rights. He's got a very, a wing in his, I don't think anybody believes that Tim Moore really has any principles about this stuff, but he has a wing in his party, in his caucus that is, very hardcore, not unlike what Kevin McCarthy deals with in Washington. So one would expect there'll be at least some effort to assuage them to some extent. So those are the kinds of things I'm sure we'll see. Just look at what's being done in other states, and I'm sure we'll see it here.
Okay. I wonder if you could mention a couple of the problems in Texas.
Well, I think we're aware that Texas has passed one of the most extreme laws in the country, but not the only extreme law that purports to ban abortion from the moment of conception without exception. They tried to attach this crazy vigilante provision to it, the notion that, random citizens could sue a provider who might have performed an abortion or aided someone in obtaining an abortion. The latest on that I'm aware of is that a court rejected that as that there's no standing for someone to bring that kind of a suit in Texas. That's the last I've heard. Yeah, I think that was last month. So, but that doesn't mean it's not, obviously the law in Texas, the law in Alabama, the law in these states aren't, they are stopping pregnant people from getting abortions, really under just an array of horrendous circumstances that would just, that just shock the conscience how absurd it is that people are put in this position and, in some instances able to travel to other places, travel very long distances. If you're deep in the heart of Texas, you got a long way to go to get to New Mexico or another possible state north of there. But it's a bad situation. And obviously the folks who are the authors of these laws they're true believers and they want to do it everywhere. Is that sort of what you were looking for?
Yep. Yes. Okay. Dr. Gray, you are in charge of the residency program. And so what are you hearing from students about going into this field?
So a lot of our conversations during the interview season revolved around kind of predictions of what would happen in North Carolina, discussions around contingency plans for training. Should North Carolina have a ban? I met with the residents soon after the Dobbs decision, and we were talking about, what might happen if North Carolina had a strict ban and they weren't able to get training. And we talked about, eventually, a generation of providers will retire. And so we're looking at 10 to 15 years of not having adequate supervision of people who know how to provide a second trimester surgical abortion, which is in certain cases needed in an emergency. I'm also a board examiner for the Board of OBGYNs, and so we every year examine folks who have been out of training for 1 to 2 years, and you talk to them about their practice. They have a case list. And I would say many of them are not adequately prepared to provide abortion care or emergency abortion care. They just didn't receive the training. They don't do those cases in their practice. And so, it's those are cases where people's lives are put at risk if you can't quickly care for them in the way that they need. So if someone comes in with a septic abortion or a severe infection after either it can happen during a miscarriage or after the water breaks in the second trimester or the middle part of pregnancy, people can become severely infected and have been some of the sickest people I've ever taken care of. But being able to quickly care for them is key to saving their lives. And so there's going to be a generation of physicians that don't have that skill if they train in a place where they don't learn that skill. And I worry about the patients in North Carolina if we have a ban 10, 15, 20 years from now, not having a group of providers with that knowledge and skill to care for them. So I think the students are cautious and asking good questions and becoming more knowledgeable about local politics. I mean, that was definitely not even part of my calculation and where I chose to go to residency, because most places you could provide that care, but now it's just not the case.
Okay, great, or bad, but. I have another question, like, are you hearing other doctors saying they might get out of the field?
Well, I think because of the pandemic, there have been a lot of people that have left medicine, nurses, physicians, advanced practice providers. And so the stresses of the pandemic have led to people leaving the field. I think what I've seen, I have a colleague who was practicing in Texas, and she recently moved to another state, or she was practicing in Tennessee. She moved to another state because of the restrictive bans in her area. I think, I don't know, we'll see what happens over the next 5 to 10 years, but I do think the pandemic has taken a toll on physicians, and then adding this extra layer. I do think, we talk about kind of attracting OBGYN physicians to this area, but I think, physicians in training are of reproductive age, and people are cautious about moving to an area where they don't have the same rights. And so I think it could impact a broader spectrum of people considering moving to North Carolina.
Actually, a friend that's now in Congress, not as a legislator, but working for a legislator, had contacted us recently because she or they are just finding out how little care is available in the rural areas already. And do you know what would help that, like Medicaid expansion or anything like that would help get more care out into the rural areas and stop the hospitals from closing?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I mean, there are many maternity care deserts in North Carolina, including Senator Berger's part of his district is the maternity care desert. So I think Medicaid expansion would be huge. I think allowing APPs to practice.
What is that?
Advanced practice providers, so midwives and nurse practitioners, have to have a greater level of supervision according to state law in North Carolina. I think there's definitely a push to change those laws. I think making it more attractive to move to rural areas and kind of having incentives, supporting those hospitals there. I don't know, maybe Rob may have ideas about that too.
We're going to use that tomorrow in our discussion.
I don't think I have a whole lot to add to that. Obviously, Medicaid expansion would bring billions of dollars to our state, and undoubtedly provide some stability to to rural hospitals. But access to rural care is a huge issue, and there are other financial and economic issues at work, obviously, within the healthcare industry that, are huge and driven by large corporations that present other challenges.
So I know I've seen, I believe I've seen legislation about making midwives and nurse practitioners not have to report to doctors. And I guess when you don't have doctors in those areas, that would especially help.
Lynn Bonner had a good story about that. If you want to read more about that issue, we do have a news story at NC Policy Watch that she wrote about that late last year.
Yes. Yes, I do. Okay, great. So this is going to lead into a couple people, I think. So clearly in Texas already, and these other states, doctors are being forced to be negligent, basically, not to give care when it's needed. And that is terrible for the patient, who may end up in sepsis before they take care of her. But what about the doctors? How is it for the doctors? That's for Dr. Gray, and then probably Rabbi Dinner.
I mean, I think it goes back to the discussion of moral injury, right? You're trying to do the right thing, and then you have to watch someone suffer until they're to what point of extreme before you care for them. I think it's different in different hospital systems in Texas, depending on probably a lot of factors. I think it's really challenging for them to not provide care that's evidence-based, and there's no other like example of that in medicine. I don't know. I've had some people try to make comparisons to different areas, like, I don't know. There's no other comparison in how it's regulated and how there's this judgment on people's decisions. I don't know. People just want to judge reproductive care in a very different way and make these kind of all-knowing decisions that impact them. But I don't know. Maybe Rabbi Jenner wants to talk about moral injury and help me out.
So I think that we're seeing that I met with a couple today who are in their 70s who left Florida because of the perceived, they didn't use the word moral injury, and it wasn't about necessarily abortion, but left Florida because of the hostility toward what they saw as women's rights and human rights and education rights and medical rights, among other things. He's retired, was a doctor. And I think that we are seeing more and more of that. It's scary to think that what we see here in our congregation is an influx who move into the state for all kinds of reasons. We all know it's a growing state. The fastest growing state, or the fastest growing area in the country, is the Triangle in Charlotte. And so we do have people moving in, but for different reasons. And moral injury, I think, is one of those reasons. And the question is, when will we tip the other way? And when will corporations moving here say we've gone too far over the line for their population to come here?
Kathy Rauch and I have discussed that many times, actually.
Yeah. I mean, and this is, I give you one example, but there are many. I talk about it with my own son in Indiana, who wants to live in Florida for professional reasons and is reluctant to do it.
Okay, perfect. So there are, okay, this is going to go to Rob and also Rabbi Dinner, I'm sure. So there are lawsuits against the abortion bans and related laws in at least 3 states, maybe now 4, Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, for example. And Rob, can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are dozens of lawsuits based on an array of premises, and many of them have been successful or have had varying degrees of success. States like South Carolina finding protection for reproductive freedom in provisions of their state constitution, but a particular aspect of some of the lawsuits that's obviously appealing to many of us, probably many of us here, and I'm sure Rabbi Dinner will want to talk about it, is this notion of religious freedom, the notion that different faiths bring different perspectives to the issue of abortion rights. And so there are 2 sort of theories here. One is that, in effect, by enacting an abortion ban based upon some person's religion, they are in effect establishing religion in violation of the Establishment Clause. And then the other side of it is that you are effectively limiting the religious rights of those who disagree with those laws and have a different concept of life. And those lawsuits are proceeding. And I believe in Indiana right now, it's been successful, at least at the trial court level. So it's a fascinating and I think very powerful and persuasive theory, and it bespeaks the fact that there are a lot of good theories out there based upon state law. The problem with that, of course, is that it creates and contributes to this patchwork we have, rather than providing any kind of, global solution to the problem.
So I have been a part, actually, in the LGBTQ community, and our very famous bathroom law succeeded in getting our movement, the Reform Movement of Judaism, to enter as a defendant in this North Carolina law, and in the LGBTQ issue, which was they've always filed friend of the court briefs, but this was the first time that they became a defendant. I was really proud of that, and I believe that this issue is another issue, if they can find the right case in the right state, that they will enter into the issue of religious rights as a moral reason, and differences in religious beliefs as a moral reason to look at this case. We all know that different religions and different ethicists, and most importantly, as much as I stand for and offer what Judaism has to offer, but most importantly, every individual woman ethically has power over, and should have power over, her own health care, end of sentence. And so I'm very aware when I share the Jewish perspective and say that this is diametrically opposed to the Catholic perspective, for example, and that what Jewish law would say is that a woman who was going to die because of a pregnancy is commanded, literally, to have an abortion. And I'm not going to go into all the details. I can cite a lot of the law. I've taught a lot of the Jewish part of the law. But I believe as a human being, as a citizen of this country, that the rights of every individual need to be the top of the reason that we are, rights and medical needs, that we are legislating or not legislating what women can do with their bodies. And that's the highest ethical teaching that our movement stands on in this. Yes, this is where we stand as a religious group, A, B, and C. And like I said, I could go into the Jewish law on that if you want. But because we recognize that different religious perspectives and different individuals have differing belief systems on this, that each person therefore has the right. We would not restrict another's right to their own body.
Great. Excellent. I may have misspoke, like I meant to say that there's lawsuits in 3 or 4 states at least. But also, Rob, you mentioned the establishment clause, and I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, but could you,
Well, I mean,
not everybody's a lawyer,
Diff-
so.
well, there is the federal, of course, the First Amendment, when I refer to the Establishment Clause, that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or establishing a religious test. You know, for instance, the North Carolina Constitution, Article 1, Section 13, sort of interesting to read, actually. It's a little bit dated, but it says, all persons have a natural and inalienable right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences, and no human authority shall in any case whatever control or interfere with the rights of conscience. It's an interesting provision. There are similar provisions to that in other states, and they have been used as the basis for bringing some of these lawsuits that saying basically you're imposing your religion on me by effecting an abortion ban.
Yay, thank you.
I think that's basic.
Great. All right. Let's see. Kind of talked about these things. So, what are the obstacles you might face performing your job if the legislature passes abortion bans or criminalizes physicians or anybody helping pregnant individuals? Like,
So,
because
I think we have to start with the doctor on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what type of ban is in place. I think in some places like Tennessee, there's been confusion around ectopic pregnancy treatment, even where pregnancy is growing outside the uterus. It's clearly not going to survive. In my mind, an ectopic is like a ticking time bomb. When it ruptures the tube, I mean, it's the most common cause of maternal mortality in the first trimester is a ruptured ectopic pregnancy that's usually unrecognized. There's like thinking about it being recognized and not treated, that's malpractice. So, I think this clause in the Constitution is really interesting because, if we are practicing with conscience and with a kind of a moral duty to provide care, these bans are contradicting that. And so I think we become, kind of, we have to deal with logistics and figuring out, okay, now we have a patient. She's really close to the ban date. Has she met her 72-hour counseling? Are we, we'll probably start providing care on weekends and nights and just doing things to be able to get people under the wire. I think that's, if you hear some of the stories from Mississippi, kind of right before the Dobbs decision went down, there's this great segment of This American Life, which I'm sure some of you listen to, where they interview the amazing women who run that clinic. And they were heroes in the end, like really providing care up until the last minute. And just when the ruling came down, they had to stop clinic in the middle of the day. There were people they had to turn away. And I think the turnaway study is a really fascinating study that I would encourage you to check out. There's a book with all the findings from the turnaway study, and it's a study out of UCSF where they studied 3 different groups of patients. So there was a group that sought first trimester care. They were able to have first trimester abortion care. There was a group that sought second trimester care, and they were able to receive that care. And then there was the turnaway group, which was a group of about 170 women. And for whatever reason, whether they were just past the gestational age limit of their state, or their state had a restrictive ban, whatever that reason, they were turned away from care and forced to continue their pregnancy. And if you look at what happens to those people, it's heartbreaking. So 2 of the people in that group died from immediate postpartum complications. 2 out of 170. So it's already a very high-risk group of people who are seeking care who are turned away. They're much more likely to be with an abusive partner. They're much more likely to live in poverty. They're much less likely to, finish school and get the job that they want, to do all the things to live that full life that, that people deserve to live. And so we're about to see the turnaway study on a much larger scale in this country, especially in the South. And so when those patients are being turned away, we will need to be ready to care for them in a different way than we are right now.
So what study is that?
It's the turnaway study. So if you Google the turnaway study, there's a nice like summary page about all the findings. And then Diana Green Foster, who is the kind of the primary researcher on that study, she wrote a whole book about the findings of the study, kind of telling all the different stories, the economic stories, the kind of health outcome stories, kind of the way people's lives changed because of being turned away.
And where is she out of?
UCSF, so San Francisco.
Great. UCSF. Okay. Anybody else on that? No. Okay. So we know about major threats at abortion clinics, and we know about threats at, temples and religious institutions. In fact, we have a security guy walking around right now. And what kind of concerns do you have in your offices, with staff, with your family at home, with your religious institutions these days?
I can begin just to say that the National Council of Jewish Women has been the organizational Jewish leader in bringing the Jewish community together on this issue. And they immediately, after the Dobbs decision, made available huge kits of action that you can take to protect women, how to approach your legislature, ways to allow people to know that your institution is a safe place for women seeking care, that we could then transfer women to places where they could get care. So we ordered a kit at Temple Beth Or and put a huge sign up on Creedmoor Road about our belief in a woman's rights and a woman's rights to choose.
I don't want us to get too bummed out tonight. And I want us to be reminded of what happened in Kansas and what happened in Kentucky and what happened to a lot of states, deeply red conservative states. But when they put this issue to a vote, the pro-choice forces won.
Before I got involved in the 20-week lawsuit, I had sort of been very protective about the work that I did and wasn't really out there talking about it. I was busy. I was providing care to patients, and I have 2 small kids, and I have other things to do with with my time, and so I wasn't really getting out there. And I think when the Dobbs decision happened, I felt a different just a different duty to get out there and to share my voice with people. And what's interesting is I started getting very involved in a lot of the media engagements, and our institution's been really supportive about getting voices of physicians and evidence-based information out there. And one of my colleagues who's in infectious disease, who's been out in the media a lot about COVID and COVID vaccines, he reached out to me. He's a friend, and he was like, when you start getting threats, the police here at Duke are really great about helping you out. And I was like, okay, thanks. And I've had a lot of friends who have been like, just make sure you're being safe. And I, this is, I guess I'm good, holy wood, I'm gonna knock on it. Thus far, I haven't really had, people reaching out and being negative in any way. It's a lot of positive feedback, because I think there's so much stigma around abortion, and so people aren't going out there and sharing their stories. But a lot of people have been impacted by abortion care. And so one of the first interviews I did was with the Wall Street Journal. And I had my picture in the Wall Street Journal, which was a big deal. And I shared it with my parents. And my parents are very religious. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. My parents are still very dedicated to the church and spend a lot of time in the church. I spent a lot of time in the church growing up. And my dad went to his pastor and went to his Sunday school class, so proud, and telling them about what I'd done. And my grandmother, my dad's mom, had been impacted by abortion in her life. So she was diagnosed with cervical cancer in pregnancy and had a second trimester abortion that saved her life. And so my dad starts telling the story to people who, you know, he wouldn't have necessarily told the story in Sunday school, but now he is, and he's probably the best ambassador for abortion rights, because he's, you know, who's going to expect a 70-year-old Southern Baptist like to come out in Sunday school and say, you know, here's what my daughter's doing, it's amazing, and this is how abortion impacted my life. And so I think as we make it okay for more people to start telling those stories, that's when the tide is going to turn. And so we have to make it safe to get out there and share these stories and talk about it with people that, you know, just may not know what their thoughts are about it, but just, you know, talk about it in ways that can change their hearts and minds, because I firmly believe that storytelling is how we help people understand what people face every day. Because, you know, there's an OBGYN in Texas, her name's Dr. Ghazal Moyetti, and she, I think, is famous for saying, you know, we all know and love someone who's had an abortion, and we shouldn't think about it as like pro-choice and pro-life, but just like we care about people who've had abortions in the past, whether they've told us or not. And so I think we have to change how we think about it.
Okay, so would you mind repeating what you said about dangers to the synagogue?
So the question back then was how are we responding to the threat, and in Jewish life, the rise in anti-Semitism, along with our position on certain positions, in some ways make people think that it is a double threat, which certainly it could be and has been. And we, as soon as the decision was made, the National Council of Jewish Women, which is an incredible national Jewish organization, then made available to all Jewish organizations in the country kits on how we could educate and help women who were impacted and work on legislation, and included lots of PR, including a kit we got here that had a big sign for us to put on the street, which we did, that said Jews are for women's choice. And our members within days, who were 100% for pro-women's rights to sovereignty over their own bodies, said you have to take it down because it's going to bring haters who will attack the synagogue. And so it's affected our behavior. It has affected our willingness to publicly get out there. Not that it would affect me or those who are for this issue in terms of going down and talking to legislators or supporting women individually, but the publicness of those decisions doesn't feel safe to many people these days.
Okay, thank you. And Rob, you were injecting some optimism.
I just made the point for all those listening on Zoom that public opinion is with us still, even in states like Kansas and Kentucky, and I'm sure it would be the case in North Carolina. Nationwide, America is pro-choice, and the more the stories are told, like Dr. Gray talks about, I think that will continue to be even more the case. We've seen although we've had lots of setbacks lately, we've seen the amazing progress we've made in LGBTQ rights in this country over the last few decades. I firmly believe we can do the same thing to move us forward in human rights in this area as well.
Cool. I want to actually, speaking of Kansas, let me just mention one thing. For our state conference, we had somebody named Ashley All from Kansas as our keynote speaker, and she was part of the effort that brought such a resounding no to people that were trying to change the Constitution in Kansas. And so the Constitution in Kansas still supports abortion rights. And their approach was really amazing. And our video is going to come out on this any day now. It was a nonpartisan approach because this isn't really a nonpartisan issue. It affects everybody. So, all pregnant people and their families and their children and their communities. So everybody. So I just wanted to mention that. It is time to change to open it up for questions. And I know I have a couple of questions from Zoom. And questions, yeah. Any postcards?
Anybody else?
Anybody else have postcards?
Okay.
And I can start with the questions from Zoom.
Okay.
Great. Okay. This is a great question, probably for Dr. Gray. Are all residents trained, and you answered this to some degree, but are all residents trained on providing abortion care currently and DNCs and stuff?
So residents can opt out of providing abortion care, so if it's, or parts of abortion care, but all residents are required to perform a minimum number of suction DNCs or, it's the same procedure for miscarriage treatment as it is for abortion, whether it's in the first trimester or second trimester. There's nothing different procedurally about what you do. In fact, you probably have more complications with miscarriage care because people have more risk of bleeding and other potential complications, but that's not really regulated, which is interesting. It's the same medication, so when we talk about evidence-based practice, it's, what does the science say is the most effective way to care for a person? So for miscarriage, the medications we use to treat miscarriage are the same that we use to treat for patients seeking medication abortion. So there's no difference there. So residents can still achieve their minimum number of procedures that's required, but it doesn't dictate like first trimester, second trimester. And then for some residents, they need a greater number to be competent. So there's a minimum number that you should achieve before it's flagged, but there's also a minimum number for competency. And so, and those two can be different for different people, like in how they learn.
Okay, and for Rabbi Dinner, somebody asked, how does Dobbs infringe on Judaism?
Well, Judaism is really clear on, and I'm not going to go into all of the Talmudic laws on this, but Judaism is really clear that the difference between potential life and the life of someone who is already born, from biblical times in the book of Exodus, it says that if someone is fighting and inadvertently kills someone on the sidelines, and this is of course harsher than the law we would want today, but it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So if you murder someone as a side product of your behavior fighting someone else, then the death penalty would be warranted. Now, one verse later it says, if the person causes a miscarriage in a pregnant woman, that in that case, it's monetary damages. So from that case, the principle, this is right in our Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. So it's very clear that there is a difference in the value of a person who is already alive and a person who is yet to be born. And then the Talmud and the commentators go further, and they say that what's happening here is that anyone who is being pursued by someone who would harm them has the right to defend themselves. Now, I think most Americans agree to that. So a woman, like, for example, having an ectopic pregnancy, is being pursued by this pregnancy and has the right to defend herself, and in Judaism, the obligation to defend her health from this harm. And so a pursuer is a specific category in Judaism, not so different, like I said, from American law that says, if someone is after you to harm you, you have the right to take care of yourself. And so that's the basis of what Judaism teaches, and we see all across, and it depends right now on what state you're in and what stage of pregnancy, that women whose life are in pursuit because of their physical health, their mental health, their economic well-being, but their lives are truly being threatened, don't have that right to protect their own life. And so that's the Jewish basis that applies generally in these cases.
Thank you. Another question is, does North Carolina's 20-week ban allow any exceptions?
So before viability, there is an exception. It's a vague exception for kind of immediate endangerment of the life of the mother. And so the vagueness of that kind of clause in the law is really why we sued the state of North Carolina, saying that how close to death do you have to be? Like, if you're in kidney failure, does that count? If you're in heart failure, if you've already got 2 kids, does it matter? Like, what's, what matters, and I think.
Specifically say though that if you're contemplating suicide.
No, it doesn't, it doesn't cover psychiatric illness. So if you're contemplating suicide, that does not.
Okay, so Rob said,
I'm sorry. Yeah, so for it can, anything impacting the health of the mother, as long as it's not mental health, it's, if it's creating immediate danger. So there are those, and there are those cases that we see patients who are severely infected, having, they're bleeding to death. There are conditions that arise at that stage in pregnancy, or kind of very early hypertensive disorders of pregnancy that can be very severe and life-threatening or life-altering. So those cases do happen. But I think, it's sometimes complicated when you have a vague law for people to feel confident in their practice. Some of it may depend on, what county they live in, and if they feel like, okay, the DA in my county is not going to prosecute me, probably, or maybe they will if they live in a more rural area. It's, the vagueness is the problem.
okay, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. So this question is, why does Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina not cover abortion services? That was one. And there's another follow-up about insurance, but I'll see if there's an answer. Anybody can answer with that.
So I think if it's the state, if you have a state medical plan, that's part of the kind of, if you're state or federal in North Carolina, your insurance plan is not allowed to cover abortion care.
Yeah, they changed the law how many years ago? They changed the law specifically to disclude state employees some years ago.
Right, and that is excluded as well, so those plans. Yeah, so any Medicaid plan. So any Medicaid plan in North Carolina does not cover abortion care. So in other states like Massachusetts and California, Medicaid, the state covers that piece of care. So they do have care for patients who are uninsured or underinsured.
It's a good question.
So following that, when people come here for an abortion, does the medical insurance in their home state cover the procedure conducted in North Carolina? How does that work?
It depends.
It depends.
Totally depends. Yeah, and I think some patients are hesitant to have things show up on their own, on their home state insurance. Could they be, there's a lot of uncertainty around patients feeling safe about anyone knowing that they've sought abortion care in another state.
Would you encourage corporations and artists to avoid North Carolina until women's bodily rights are respected?
Oh, I don't know. I'm all for, certainly, we've seen, I don't think there's any doubt that Apple Computer has made a huge difference in stopping the don't say gay stuff. And I think that kind of pressure being applied by large corporations can make a difference. I think there's some concern that maybe it's not as powerful as it once was. And we've seen sort of the disturbing pushback in Florida from some of the folks on the right. I don't know. I'd have to think about whether I want to say here, it's time to boycott North Carolina again. I can envision such a time coming pretty quick.
Well, I would say that for HB2, it was wonderful how the corporations really got behind the LGBTQ community, and we would like them to be behind women as well.
I think my only point is that I'm not sure whether now's the time for that, or is it,
In a month.
if a ban is enacted, I can
Right.
envision it a lot easier to get that done than say, I mean, I agree that the current law is bad and it has a lot of flaws, but I think it would be difficult perhaps to sort of muster such a campaign right now.
This question is, what is the demographic socioeconomic makeup of women who come from out of state?
Oh, yeah. Dr. Gray.
I don't know that I have that data necessarily. I mean, it's interesting, to think about who can travel. Most people living an ordinary life in this country are not in a place of privilege or a place where they even have $400 saved up for an emergency. So if you think about, the majority of people seeking abortion care already have a child, so they're seeking child care, they're getting time off work, they're traveling. If they're in the second trimester, they're traveling and having to stay overnight or maybe 2 nights. And those hurdles are impossible for most people in this country.
I want to say also that I worry a lot about, one of the things the National Council of Jewish Women does is partner with organizations that are offering funds, and significant funds for people to travel to get abortions. I worry that the women who are in the cases that you described don't have good access to that information and won't know. And so I'm hoping we can, as a hopeful thing we can do, is to ramp up the connection. I don't know if your department is connected with some of those organizations providing the money.
So we are NAF providers, and so that's National Abortion Federation. And so there is a system of support through NAF. And so if patients call, they can have information about different clinics that partner with them, and then access to funding. And then there are other funds available. The Carolina Abortion Fund is another local one that I think is doing a lot of good work. There's a group that we've worked with a lot is called CRAN, Carolina Reproductive Action Network, I think is what it stands for. It used to be the Charlotte Reproductive Action Network. And they're a system of volunteers that provide transportation, childcare, housing. Here in North Carolina, or in Durham, some of the folks from that group will take people to the airport or pick people up from the airport or be their ride or be their kind of support person. And so there's some amazing people out there doing work to help people get the care that they need. But it's too much to ask people to do that. And it's just incredibly unfair that your zip code dictates, what your reproductive outcomes are going to be like. And I think we're going to see we already know maternal mortality in states with restrictive bans is high. It's connected. And it's unfortunate.
Okay, this question, do you want to go ahead?
No, I just.
Okay, you're just in the middle. Okay, so as you may know, medical abortion is available. There are pills that help you do an abortion for you. And North Carolina has interesting laws restricting that. And I know now has been involved in educating people on this at the national conferences and at the state conferences. These medicines have been around for a long time, and they were just found to help you get help with abortions, to do abortions by accident. And the question here is limiting access to the abortion pills online or through telehealth creates a big financial burden to pay for abortion services and associated travel expenses. Are there any workarounds available? Is the question.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I know there is this lawsuit, I think I mentioned it earlier, that's been filed in North Carolina.
Yesterday, right?
Yes, right, and there's a story on our website by Lynn Bonner about it. OBGYN with a practice in Orange County suing federal court over restrictions the state imposes on providing an abortion pill, which requires you to be there in person and all those kinds of things.
Right.
Not required in other states.
So, I mean, I think patients probably have their own workarounds. I think within what's kind of legal within our system, there these laws that make patients come to my office, and I guess there's something magical about me watching them take the pill. I don't know.
Right?
I mean, they get to meet me, so maybe that's all. Oh, there you go. But it's really stupid. But, patients can look up online and they can get medication abortion. I think the thing that's different with the post-Dobbs world as far as comparing it to the pre-Roe world is that medication abortion is incredibly safe. And there's a lot of evidence that patients can safely self-manage their own abortion. And so I think in places where abortion's restricted, patients will probably seek ways to access medication to care for their early pregnancies. So the question is, how long can you use medication? In most people's practice, we offer it up through 11 weeks. There's some evidence around 12 weeks as well.
I have a quick question here, and I think really kind of brings things together. So in the last part of our program talks about impactful actions. And so how can we come together to prioritize and pick an action that will be impactful? So with those that we had listed in the program, that was the question. What can we do to prioritize some of those?
Well, I think people can come together to pay really close attention to what's going to be happening in the General Assembly and show up. I mean, we know the reality right now in North Carolina is that it's hanging by a thread. In the North Carolina House of Representatives, Democrats have 49 votes. Republicans have 71. You need 72 to override a gubernatorial veto. So thus far, since the Republicans lost their supermajority in 2018, they have not overridden a Cooper veto. So it will be, I mean, just getting down to it, right? There will be a fight. In all likelihood, a bill will be sent to Governor Cooper this session. He will veto it, and we'll find out whether any Democrats are willing to be the person who casts the vote that makes a new abortion restriction. So, I mean, that's going to be, I think, front and center over the coming months. That's probably the first place that organization will be necessary.
So I'm kind of in a different perspective in terms of what's the best. I mean, I'm looking at the list you have here: call, write, visit, organize, escort, march, attend, join and support, stay informed, donate, etc. I don't know that there is one best. I firmly believe there's not one best way. Rather, there is the way that you can act, and you can then get others who are like-minded to join with you in those actions. That I would never condemn anyone for not marching or not escorting or not protesting or for doing any of those things, and say, if you spent your time this way, it would be better. All of them are going to be needed, and we have to open ourselves also to the comfort level.
No, I totally agree. I think definitely getting voices out there, writing op-eds are important. I do think legislators read op-eds. I think they don't necessarily read the New York Times. So op-eds in local papers are actually really important. And so getting your voices out there is key. kind of pre-Dobbs, I helped start this group at Duke called the Dream Team, which is the Duke Reproductive Health, Equity, and Advocacy Mobilization Team. I'm trying to remember all the acronym, because every good group needs a good acronym, right? So we have a group of healthcare professionals across the healthcare system who meet with legislators and other officials on a monthly basis, and we have different trainings on writing op-eds and getting involved, because I do think medical professional voices are really important, because this shouldn't be an issue that's kind of affects one political party or another. It affects all the patients that we care for. And I think we care for patients from a variety of different backgrounds and beliefs, and many patients who come to us never thought they would need our care. And so I think, getting voices out there, knowing what's going on in your local area and understanding. I mean, for us doing the work, we weren't surprised about Dobbs. We knew it was coming. And so don't be surprised. I think you gotta, be reading NC Policy Watch and, listening to Rob here.
Definitely.
And, I think helping support patients who are traveling out of state, I think that's a worthy cause. I think that is an important way that you can get involved and volunteer. But I think just educating yourselves, getting your voices out there, that's important. And I think knowing who your legislators are, I think one good piece of advice we were given is, don't make the first time you're meeting your legislator a time when you're asking for something. Like, reach out and tell them what you care about. Aside from, reproductive health rights, there are lots of other things that we care about that we want our legislators to know about. So reach out and make those connections.
Okay, so I just want to say a couple more things, and Jerry's going to go. The Food and Drug Administration handled the abortion pills different than they handled all of the other medicine during the pandemic. And they got pushback on that finally, but that happened. And here's a statement that was delivered to me. If men could get pregnant, we'd have safe drive-through abortions with fries. Same if the baby daddy had fiscal responsibility. So Jerry Richards, the Chapel Hill president, is going to come up and do the closing, and soon we're going to eat.
Okay, thank you, Galia. I'm not as short as she is, so I'm going to, I guess, just use one microphone, but I think you all can hear me. I can raise my voice. I was a teacher, so, make sure you're paying attention. I want to thank you, audience, for coming, both in those of you who are present here and those of you who are on Zoom right now. We're really grateful for your support, first of all. And I'm really a little overwhelmed by the information. As you can imagine, in preparing for this, all the time that I've been in now, I've been reading a lot about this very issue, about the various cases, and so forth, and spending a little extra time recently being sure that I knew exactly what was happening and how our panelists would respond or might respond to the issues they'd be interested in. But this was really an incredible thing, so much so that I think we all might feel a little overwhelmed. So the first thing I'm going to say is maybe we ought to take a big breath right now and let it go a little bit. But some of what people were saying at the end, I was going to deal with, so I'm going to cut that down just a little bit. And I want to say to you, first of all, from my own experience in coming to now over the last few years, there are two things that I have learned about activism. One of them is that you have to believe. You have to believe that you can have an impact. I was very uncertain whether I could, but I have seen little differences in my own community at Chapel Hill. I've had people reach out to me after spending a lot of time as the only person at my meeting. I now have over 100 people who are listed as active Chapel Hill Now members. So I know it from experience that you can make a difference, and you have to internalize that. It doesn't happen right away, but you have to keep that in mind even in your lowest moments. And then the second thing is that you have to make a promise to yourself. And the promise that you have to make to yourself is that you will move a little bit past your comfort zone. And once you do that once in a very non-aggressive way, and we don't want any of these actions to really be aggressive, because you really don't get anywhere with that. You really just get more pushback from it. And as the rabbi was saying earlier, as she sat down with people who were very opposed to her point of view, she followed that kind of idea of listening and finding commonality. But so the second thing is to make this promise to yourself that I will move past my comfort zone. Now, I think you're all looking at the actions that will have an impact, and they are really by no means all that you can do. So I'd like you to look at that, and I'm offering kind of a different way of dealing with the question that came up at the end here. And I'm going to change it a little bit. People ask, what's the best thing? And I don't think that's really the question. The question begins with, what am I going to do? What do I feel comfortable in this moment at this time doing? And I want you to think of it in a way as yourself as the middle of a circle, and that there are 3 concentric circles around you. The first concentric circle, excuse me while I turn my page. The first circle deals with facing those that you know, your family, your friends, your close associates. You have to define that. And to use personal and sometimes, and also very casual communications to tell them or to bring up some of the things that you're reading. This is a technique that people have begun to use in getting out the vote, talking to their neighbors, and I think that it can be used in very much the same way. And if you're with friendly faces, it's a way of practicing talking to some people who are not so friendly. So that's your first circle. That's a place that's in most everyone's comfort zone. Once you start doing that, think about that second circle. Well, look at the list here. You know, the personal communications are on that list, or maybe they should be. And then there's what I would call, instead of the take your daughter to work day, take your friend to an event day. You know, say, I'm going to this march. How would you like to have lunch? And then we can go march. Or we can march first and then have lunch. That's a old kind of thing that my husband and I always do. Let's go to the anti-war march and then we can have lunch afterwards. Which makes it sound funny, but you have a life to live. You know, let's enjoy our lives. So let's go to the second circle. After you talk to those people that you know, talk to those people or deal with those people that you know of. All right, but don't necessarily have in your closest circle. Look at your list. Who is there or what is there that you know of, but you're not a part of? All right? This is where you can join or support the work of social justice organizations, where you can volunteer at a clinic or volunteer in some other way in one of these organizations that is funding women and helping women. Once you're there and you feel comfortable there, you can go back to circle 1. That's okay. or do that on the side. But then let's proceed further. Let's push ourselves a little further to circle 3, where we have those I want to or need to know. In other words, they're really removed from my social sphere, but have social or political influence. This is where your legislatures come in. Look at the list. What else is there that's in this? Follow the legislation that's coming up. Subscribe to NC Policy Watch. It's in your email then every morning. You can't ignore it. It becomes a habit with your coffee. Letters to the editor. And the one that I find most fascinating that I can't imagine that I would ever do is a podcast, in spite of the fact that I obviously like to talk. People don't get that I am no longer living in New York because of this. So anyway, we have to push ourselves a little bit. So remember those 2 things that I said: believe and promise. Also be kind to yourself in the end. This work has a start line, but it really has no finish line. We have to accept, after we've seen this shock of the Dobbs decision, that this is never going to end. Maybe it'll surprise us, and someday it will. However, I do have a final thought for you that feeds on that, and I hope helps you to leave here with a commitment. This final thought is from Reverend Katie Zen. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and this is what she has said. Part of our call in these times is to be bold in holding on to the vision of a world we have not yet seen, but we believe is possible. Thank you.
Okay, so we have food across the hall. Eat up. Thank you.